Margaret Foster had never seen so much sky in her entire life. Standing outside the tiny airport in Billings, Montana, she tilted her head back and felt dizzy looking at the endless blue stretching in every direction. Back home in Boston, buildings cut the sky into neat little squares. Here, it felt like the whole world had been turned upside down and shaken out like a bedsheet. She pulled her phone from her purse and stared at the single bar of signal. One bar. In Boston, she got full service everywhere, even in the subway tunnels. Here, her phone felt as useless as a paperweight. The rental car keys felt heavy in her other hand as she walked toward the small parking lot, her heels clicking against the concrete with each careful step. The car was bigger than anything she'd ever driven. Back home, she took the subway everywhere. The few times she needed a car, she used those little city cars that barely fit two people. This thing looked like it could hold her entire apartment. She adjusted the mirrors 3 times before feeling brave enough to start the engine. The drive to her aunt's ranch took 2 hours, and Margaret spent most of it gripping the steering wheel like her life depended on it. The roads here weren't like the neat grid of Boston streets. They curved and dipped and rose without warning. Mountains appeared in the distance like sleeping giants, and fields stretched so far she couldn't see where they ended. Her Aunt Rebecca had left her this ranch in her will, which came as a shock to everyone in the family. Margaret had only met her aunt a handful of times at family gatherings. Rebecca was the one who always seemed a little out of place at dinner tables, talking about horses and weather patterns while everyone else discussed stock prices and restaurant reviews. Margaret's mother had shaken her head when the lawyer called. "I don't know why she left it to you," she'd said. "You've never even been camping." Which was true. Margaret's idea of roughing it was staying at a hotel without room service. The GPS on her phone kept losing signal, leaving her to navigate by the handwritten directions the lawyer had given her. Turn left at the big oak tree. Continue past the red barn. When you see the fence with 3 posts, you're almost there. It was like following a treasure map written by someone who assumed everyone knew what a fence with 3 posts looked like. When she finally found the dirt road that led to the ranch, Margaret's rental car began making sounds she'd never heard before. Gravel pinged against the underside, and dust clouds rose in her rearview mirror. Her hands were shaking now, and not just from the rough road. What was she doing here? She belonged in libraries and coffee shops, not on some remote ranch in the middle of nowhere. The house appeared through the trees like something from a movie. It was smaller than she'd expected, with a wraparound porch and windows that needed new paint. Behind it stood a red barn that had seen better days, and beyond that, fields that seemed to go on forever. A few chickens pecked around in a fenced area near the barn, looking perfectly content with their simple lives. Margaret parked the car and sat for a moment, trying to work up the courage to get out. Through the windshield, she could see clothes hanging on a line, moving gently in the breeze. Someone had been taking care of this place. The lawyer had mentioned something about a caretaker, but she'd been too overwhelmed with paperwork to pay attention to the details. She opened the car door and immediately understood why people talked about fresh country air. It didn't smell like car exhaust and coffee shops. It smelled like grass and earth and something she couldn't identify but somehow made her want to take deeper breaths. Her first step onto the gravel was a mistake. Her heel, perfect for navigating. Boston sidewalks sank into the loose stones like quicksand. She wobbled, caught herself, and looked down at her outfit with growing dismay. The navy blue suit that made her feel confident and professional in the city looked ridiculous here. She might as well have worn a ball gown to go hiking. A rooster crowed somewhere nearby, and Margaret jumped. She'd never heard that sound in real life, only in movies. It was louder than she'd expected, and somehow more urgent. The chickens in their pen stopped what they were doing and looked at her with curious black eyes, as if they were trying to figure out what this strange creature in the wrong clothes was doing in their territory. Margaret pulled her suitcase from the trunk, its wheels immediately clogging with dirt and gravel. She'd packed for a quick trip, maybe a weekend at most. Fly out, meet with the lawyer, sign some papers, put the place up for sale. Fly home, simple, clean, the way she liked things, but Standing here now, looking at this place her aunt had called home, nothing felt simple anymore. The silence was overwhelming. In Boston there was always noise. Traffic, sirens, people talking, construction, music from somewhere. Here, the only sounds were wind and birds and the distant lowing of cattle she couldn't see. She dragged her suitcase up the porch steps, each bump making her wince. The wooden boards creaked under her feet, and she found herself walking carefully, as if the whole thing might collapse if she wasn't gentle enough. A rocking chair sat near the front door, worn smooth by years of use. Next to it, a small table held a coffee cup that still had a ring of dried coffee in the bottom. Someone had been sitting here recently. Someone who felt comfortable enough to leave their cup behind, who thought of this porch as their own space. Margaret felt like she was trespassing, even though the papers in her purse said this was legally hers now. The front door was unlocked, which would have horrified her in Boston, but somehow felt natural here. She pushed it open and stepped inside, breathing in the smell of old wood and something that might have been lavender. The house was quiet but not empty. It felt like someone had just stepped out for a moment and would be back soon. Sunlight streamed through windows that looked out over fields and sky. The furniture was simple but comfortable, nothing like the carefully coordinated pieces in her apartment back home. These looked like chairs and tables that had been chosen for use, not for how they looked in magazines. A photograph on the mantel showed her Aunt Rebecca standing next to a man in a cowboy hat. Both of them were smiling, and Rebecca looked happier than Margaret had ever seen her at family gatherings. There were other photos, too. Rebecca feeding chickens, Rebecca standing in a garden, Rebecca sitting on the porch with the same coffee cup Margaret had seen outside. For the first time since getting the call about the inheritance, Margaret felt something other than panic or confusion. Looking at these pictures, seeing evidence of her aunt's life here, she felt curious. What had drawn Rebecca to this place? What had made her choose this quiet, simple life over the busy world Margaret knew? A sound outside made her look through the window. A pickup truck was coming up the drive, moving slowly and carefully as if the driver was used to sharing the road with wandering chickens. Margaret's heart started beating faster. She wasn't ready to meet anyone yet. She needed time to figure out what she was going to say, how she was going to explain what she was doing here when she wasn't even sure herself. Margaret watched through the window as the pickup truck came to a gentle stop near the barn. The engine turned off, and for a moment everything was quiet again. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged here, someone who knew every rock and tree and fence post on the property. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His jeans were faded but clean, and his boots looked like they'd walked 1,000 miles. Most noticeable was the hat he wore, a brown cowboy hat that had clearly seen its share of storms and sunny days. It wasn't the kind of hat you bought in a store for a costume party. This was a working hat, shaped by time and weather into something that fit him perfectly. Margaret stepped back from the window, suddenly aware that she was watching him like some kind of spy. She smoothed down her suit jacket and tried to prepare herself for whatever conversation was about to happen. Through the glass, she could see him walking toward the chicken coop. Moving with purpose but without hurry, he stopped at the gate and pulled something from his pocket. Chicken feed, she realized, as several birds came running toward him with excited clucking sounds. He scattered the feed with practiced motions, talking to the chickens in a low voice she couldn't quite hear from inside the house. The way he moved told her this was a daily routine, something he'd done hundreds of times before. Margaret took a deep breath and walked to the front door. Her heels clicked loudly on the wooden floor, announcing her presence whether she wanted to or not. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, immediately feeling out of place again in her city clothes. The man looked up from the chickens and saw her. For a moment they just stared at each other across the yard. Then he straightened up, touched the brim of his hat in a polite gesture, and started walking toward the house. "You must be Rebecca's niece," he said when he got close enough to speak without shouting. His voice was calm and steady, with a slight drawl that reminded Margaret of old movies. "I'm Jake Williams. I've been looking after the place." Margaret. Foster, she replied, stepping down from the porch to meet him halfway. Her heel immediately sank into the soft earth, and she had to catch herself to avoid stumbling. Jake noticed but was polite enough not to comment. "Sorry for your loss," he said, and Margaret could tell he meant it. "Rebecca was a good woman. Real good to work for, and good to the animals too." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak for a moment. Everyone kept telling her they were sorry for her loss, but the truth was she barely knew her aunt. It felt wrong to accept sympathy for grief she wasn't sure she was entitled to feel. "Thank you," she managed. I wasn't sure anyone would be here. The lawyer mentioned the caretaker, but that'd be me," Jake said with a small smile. "Been working here about 5 years now. Your aunt, she needed someone to help with the heavy work, and I needed a place to stay. Worked out good. For both of us." He gestured toward a small cabin Margaret hadn't noticed before, tucked between some trees behind the main house. It was simple but well-maintained, with a small porch and flower boxes under the windows. "I live over there," Jake continued. "Don't want you thinking I was staying in the main house or anything." Rebecca, she was real proper about things like that. Margaret felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She hadn't been thinking anything inappropriate, but now that he'd mentioned it, she realized she probably should have wondered where he lived. City life hadn't prepared her for the logistics of rural property management. "Of course," she said quickly. I don't really know how any of this works." Jake tilted his head slightly, studying her face. "You've never been on a ranch before, have you? Is it that obvious?" Margaret asked, looking down at her completely inappropriate outfit. "Well," Jake said diplomatically, "those shoes are real pretty, but they're not gonna do you much good out here." Margaret laughed despite herself. It was the first time she'd laughed since getting the news about the inheritance. "Everything I own is wrong for this place. I came thinking I'd be here for maybe 2 days, just long enough to sign papers and figure out how to sell it." Something shifted in Jake's expression, but he kept his voice neutral. "And now?" Margaret looked around at the fields and the sky and the chickens pecking contentedly in their pen. "Now I'm not sure what I'm thinking." Jake nodded as if this made perfect sense. Rebecca used to say this place had a way of getting under people's skin. Said it took her about a week to fall in love with it when she first moved here. "She wasn't from here originally?" "No, ma'am. Came from back east, just like you. Chicago, I think. Had a big job in some office building, worked all kinds of crazy hours. Then she inherited this place from her uncle, just like you're inheriting it from her." Margaret stared at him. "I had no idea. She didn't talk about her old life much." Sighed. It felt like something that happened to somebody else. Jake adjusted his hat, a gesture Margaret was beginning to recognize as something he did when he was thinking. "Want me to show you around? Might help you understand what you're dealing with here." Margaret looked down at her shoes again, then at the uneven ground between here and the barn. "I'm not really dressed for a tour. Got any other shoes with you?" "Just sneakers, but they're white and ... "White shoes get dirty," Jake said matter-of-factly. "Dirt washes off. Come on, I'll go slow." 20 minutes later, Margaret was following Jake around the property in her white sneakers, which were no longer white. Her suit jacket was draped over the porch railing, and she'd rolled up her sleeves like someone who actually planned to do something useful. Jake showed her the vegetable garden Rebecca had planted, pointing out tomatoes and beans and herbs Margaret couldn't identify. He explained how the irrigation system worked, where the tools were kept, and which plants needed the most attention. His knowledge seemed endless, but he shared it without making her feel stupid for not knowing. Rebecca spent most mornings out. "Here," he said, kneeling to pull a weed from between the tomato plants. Said it helped her think. She'd bring her coffee out and just sit on that little bench there, watching everything grow. Margaret could picture it. Her aunt, who had always seemed restless and distracted at family dinners, sitting peacefully among her plants as the sun came up. It was a side of Rebecca she'd never imagined. Next, Jake led her to the barn, which was bigger inside than it looked from the outside. It smelled like hay and leather and something else she couldn't name but found oddly comforting. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the wooden walls, creating patterns on the floor that shifted as clouds moved across the sky. "We keep the feed in here," Jake explained, showing her large bins filled with different types of grain. "Chickens eat different stuff than the horses did, and both are different from cattle feed." "There were horses?" Margaret asked. "2 of them. Until last year. Rebecca loved those horses more than just about anything. When they passed, she said she was too old to start over with new ones." Jake's voice softened. "I think losing them broke her heart a little bit." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both thinking about Rebecca and her horses and all the life that had happened in this place before Margaret arrived. "The chickens," Margaret said finally. I've seen them in pictures, but ... double quotes." Jake smiled. "Want to meet them properly?" Margaret followed Jake toward the chicken coop, her white sneakers squelching slightly in the soft earth. With each step, she felt her city confidence slipping away like water through her fingers. The chickens had noticed their approach and were gathering near the fence, clucking and fluffing their feathers in what seemed like excited anticipation. "They're bigger than I thought they'd be," Margaret said, stopping a few feet from the gate. In her mind, chickens had always been small, neat creatures from picture books. These were substantial birds with bright eyes and personalities that seemed to shine through their feathered faces. Jake chuckled. "That big red one there, that's Henrietta? She's the boss of this whole operation. The brown and white spotted one is Dolly, and the little black one trying to push her way to the front is Pepper. Rebecca named them all." "Your aunt talked to them like they were people," Jake continued, opening the gate with practiced ease. "Used to tell them about her day, ask their opinions on things. Sounds silly, maybe, but those birds knew her voice better than most people did." Margaret watched as Jake stepped into the pen, immediately surrounded by chickens who seemed genuinely happy to see him. They pecked gently at his boots and made soft cooing sounds that almost sounded like conversation. One of them, the red one he'd called Henrietta, looked directly at Margaret with what appeared to be curiosity. "Come on in," Jake said, holding the gate open. "They're real friendly once you get to know them." Margaret hesitated at the threshold. The chickens were looking at her now, their heads tilting this way and that as they studied this new person in their territory. She'd read somewhere that birds were descendants of dinosaurs, and standing here looking into their bright, intelligent eyes, she could almost see it. "I don't know," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "What if they ... what if they don't like me?" "Why wouldn't they like you?" Jake asked gently. Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks. How could she explain that she'd spent her whole life avoiding situations where she might fail or look foolish? How could she tell him that at 28 years old, she'd never pet a dog without asking permission first? Never picked up a cat, never done anything that required trusting an animal to be gentle with her? "I've just never..." She started, then stopped. The words felt too revealing, too embarrassing to say out loud, but Jake waited patiently, not pushing her to continue, not making jokes about city people or acting like her fear was unreasonable. His quiet acceptance made it easier to find her voice. "I've never been pecked," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush. I've never been around chickens at all. I don't know how to act around them or what they might do or..." She trailed off, realizing how ridiculous she sounded, but Jake didn't laugh. Instead, he slowly removed his hat, holding it in both hands as he looked at her with something that might have been understanding. "Let's begin slow," he said simply. There was something in the way he said it that made Margaret feel like he wasn't just talking about the chickens. Like maybe he understood that this whole experience, this whole world, was foreign territory for her. Like maybe he realized she needed patience not just with farm animals, but with everything about this new life she'd stumbled into. "First thing," Jake said, replacing his hat and moving to stand beside the fence instead of inside the pen, "is just watching them. You don't have to touch anything or go anywhere. Just see how they move, how they act with each other." Margaret relaxed slightly, watching as she could do. She was good at observing, at staying on the sidelines and learning before jumping in. It was how she'd survived library school, graduate programs, job interviews, And most of life in general. The chickens, sensing that the excitement of a potential new visitor had passed, went back to their daily activities. Some scratched at the ground with their feet, uncovering bugs and seeds with surprising efficiency. Others preened their feathers or took dust baths in shallow depressions they'd created in the dirt. See how Henrietta keeps an eye on everything? Jake pointed to the red hen, who was indeed glancing around at her flockmates while she foraged. She's making sure everyone's safe. Chickens are prey animals, so they're always watching for danger, but they're also really social. They like being together. Margaret watched Henrietta patrol her territory, noting how the other chickens seemed to defer to her without any obvious conflict. She's like a mother watching her children. Exactly. And see how they're not really bothering each other? They've got their pecking order figured out, literally. Everyone knows their place, so there's no fighting about it. As if to demonstrate, Jake's point, a smaller brown chicken approached the food dish at the same time as a larger white one. The brown chicken immediately stepped back, waiting her turn without any fuss. When the white chicken finished, the brown one moved in to eat. That seems so peaceful, Margaret said. So simple. Simple doesn't mean easy, Jake replied. Took them time to figure out how to live together. But once they did, everyone knows what to expect. Margaret found herself thinking about her life back in Boston, where every interaction felt like a negotiation, where she never quite knew what people expected from her or whether she was meeting their standards. Here, watching these chickens, everything seemed clearer somehow. Your aunt used to say that animals made more sense than people, Jake continued. Said they were honest about what they wanted and didn't play games. What did she want? Margaret asked. I mean, why did she come here? Why did she leave Chicago? Jake was quiet for a moment, watching Pepper chase a grasshopper across the pen. I think she was tired of being someone she wasn't. Said she spent years wearing clothes that didn't fit right and smiling at people who didn't really see her. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She looked down at her navy suit now, wrinkled and dusty from the day's adventures. Back home, this suit made her feel professional and competent. Here, it felt like a costume she'd forgotten to take off after a play had ended. Did she ever talk about being scared? Margaret asked quietly. All the time, Jake said. First month. She was here, she called me over every time she heard a strange noise. Took her weeks to feel comfortable collecting eggs by herself. But she kept trying, kept pushing herself a little bit every day. And then one day I came over for morning chores, and there she was, sitting right in the middle of the pen with Henrietta on her lap, both of them calm as could be. Rebecca looked up at me and said, I think I'm starting to understand myself. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. She'd never known this version of her aunt. This woman who'd been brave enough to completely change her life, who'd learned to find peace in the simple act of feeding chickens and watching them scratch in the dirt. I don't know if I'm brave enough for this, Margaret whispered. Jake looked at her seriously. Your aunt wasn't brave when she got here. She got brave by being here. Big difference. One of the chickens, the little black one called Pepper, had wandered close to the fence where Margaret stood. She looked up at Margaret with bright, curious eyes, tilting her head as if asking a question. What does she want? Margaret asked. Probably. Just checking you out. Seeing if you're someone she wants to know better, Jake smiled. Chickens are pretty good judges of character. Margaret slowly crouched down, bringing herself closer to Pepper's level. The chicken didn't run away. Instead, she took a cautious step closer, then another. Hello, Pepper, Margaret said softly. The chicken made a gentle clucking sound, almost like a greeting. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Margaret felt something other than fear or confusion. Looking into this small creature's trusting eyes, she felt a tiny spark of possibility, a whisper of the courage her aunt had somehow found in this place. The next morning, Margaret woke up to a sound she'd never heard before. Not the honking of car horns or the rumble of subway trains, but the gentle crowing of a rooster somewhere outside her window. For a moment, she lay still in her aunt's bed, listening to this new alarm clock and trying to remember, Where she was, sunlight was streaming through curtains that Rebecca had obviously chosen for function rather than fashion. They were simple white cotton, clean and practical, and they let in just enough light to make the room feel welcoming without being harsh. Margaret stretched and realized something surprising. She'd slept better than she had in months, back in Boston. She always woke up feeling like she needed more sleep. Like 8 hours somehow wasn't enough to prepare her for another day of deadlines and meetings and the constant, low-level anxiety that seemed to follow her everywhere. Here, after just one night, she felt rested in a way that went deeper than just sleep. A gentle knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret grabbed her robe and hurried downstairs, suddenly aware that she had no idea what time it was. Through the window, she could see Jake standing on the porch, holding 2 steaming coffee cups and looking like he'd been up for hours. "Morning," he said when she opened the door. "Thought you might want some coffee before we start the day. What time is it?" Margaret asked, accepting the cup gratefully. "About 7. Early for city folks, I guess, but the animals don't much care what time zone we're used to." Margaret took a sip of the coffee and nearly sighed with pleasure. It was stronger than anything she drank in Boston, rich and dark and somehow perfect for this place. "This is really good." Rebecca's recipe. She said weak coffee was one of life's greatest disappointments. Jake smiled. She left detailed instructions for everything, including how to make coffee that could wake the dead. They sat on the porch steps, drinking their coffee and watching the chickens start their day. Margaret was wearing jeans and a t-shirt today, clothes she'd packed thinking she might need to look casual for the lawyer meeting. They felt strange but not uncomfortable, like she was trying on a different version of herself. "So what exactly did you do for my aunt?" Margaret asked. "I mean, day to day." "Bit of everything," Jake said. "Fixed things when they broke, kept the garden watered, made sure the chickens were fed and safe. During planting season, I'd help her with the vegetables. During harvest, we'd can tomatoes and beans until our fingers were stained green. You cooked together?" "Rebecca did the cooking. I just helped with the heavy lifting," Jake grinned. "Woman could make a meal out of anything. Last summer, we had so many zucchini from the garden that she made zucchini bread, zucchini soup, zucchini casserole, and something she called zucchini surprise." "What was the surprise?" "More zucchini," Margaret laughed, and the sound surprised her. When was the last time she'd laughed before 10 in the morning? When was the last time she'd sat on a porch, drinking coffee and talking to someone without checking her phone every few minutes? "Want to learn how to collect eggs?" Jake asked when they finished their coffee. Margaret's stomach fluttered with nervousness, but she nodded. Yesterday, just being near the chickens had felt like a major accomplishment. Today, maybe she could push herself a little further. Jake led her to a small shed next to the chicken coop and handed her a wicker basket. "The trick is moving slow and talking gentle. Chickens don't like sudden movements or loud noises. What if they peck me?" "They probably won't, but if they do, it's not that bad." "Like getting pinched, mostly." Jake opened the coop door. Rebecca used to say the anticipation was always worse than the reality. Inside the coop, several chickens were sitting in wooden boxes filled with straw. They looked up when Margaret and Jake entered, but they didn't seem alarmed. Henrietta, the red hen Margaret remembered from yesterday, clucked softly as if saying, "Good morning. See those boxes along the wall? Those are nesting boxes. The hens lay their eggs in there because it feels safe and private." Jake pointed to a box where a brown and white chicken sat quietly. "That's Dolly. She's probably got an egg under her, but she's not ready to give it up yet. How do you know?" "She's still sitting tight. When they're done, they usually get up and move around, let you know the egg's ready for collection." They waited quietly, and Margaret found herself relaxing into the rhythm of it. There was no rushing here, no schedule that couldn't bend around the natural pace of things. After a few minutes, Dolly stood up, ruffled her feathers, and stepped out of the nesting box with what looked like pride. "There we go," Jake said. "Your turn." Margaret approached the nesting box slowly, basket in hand. The egg sat in the straw like a small miracle, brown and smooth and still warm. She'd bought thousands of eggs from grocery stores, but she'd never thought about where they actually came from, about the living creature who had created this perfect little package. "Just pick it up gentle," Jake encouraged. "It's stronger than you think." Margaret reached into the box and carefully lifted the egg. It was heavier than she'd expected and warm in a way that surprised her. She placed it in the basket like it was made of glass. "One down," Jake said. "About 7 more to go." The next few eggs were easier. The chickens seemed to understand what was happening and moved aside when Margaret approached their boxes. A couple of them made soft clucking sounds that almost seemed like encouragement. When they collected the last egg, Margaret realized she was smiling. That wasn't scary at all. "Most things aren't once you actually do them," Jake said. "Your aunt used to say fear was just excitement without permission." They walked back toward the house, Margaret carrying her basket of eggs like treasure. "What do you do with this many eggs?" "Eat some, sell some to neighbors, give some away." Rebecca always said good food was meant to be shared. In the kitchen, Jake showed Margaret how to clean the eggs and check them for cracks. It was simple work, but there was something satisfying about it, something that connected her to the chickens and the land and her aunt's daily routines. "Rebecca left instructions for you," Jake said, pulling a notebook from a kitchen drawer. She was real organized about everything. Margaret opened the notebook and found pages of careful handwriting. Instructions for feeding the chickens, watering the garden, maintaining the equipment. But scattered throughout were little notes that revealed her aunt's personality. "Remember, Henrietta doesn't like to be rushed. The tomatoes on the south side need extra water. Jake likes his coffee strong enough to wake the neighbors." "She wrote about you," Margaret said, looking up from the notebook. "She wrote about everything that mattered to her." Jake replied quietly as the days passed. Margaret fell into a routine she never could have imagined back in Boston. She woke up early, not because an alarm forced her to, but because she wanted to see the sunrise over the fields. She learned to read the sky for weather, to tell the difference between clouds that meant rain and clouds that were just passing through. Jake taught her how to tend the garden, showing her which plants needed water and which ones were best left alone. Her hands, soft from years of handling nothing rougher than computer keyboards, began to develop small calluses. Her skin, pale from fluorescent office lighting, started to take on a gentle tan. The work was physical in a way her old job never was. By evening, she was tired in her muscles rather than tired in her mind. It was a different kind of exhaustion, one that felt earned rather than imposed. "You're getting the hang of this," Jake said one evening as they finished watering the garden. Together, Margaret looked at her dirt-stained hands and grass-stained knees. 3 weeks ago, she would have been horrified by her appearance. Now, she felt proud of the evidence that she'd accomplished something real, something that mattered. "I never thought I could do any of this," she admitted. "Doing's just practice," Jake said simply. "You practice being brave often enough. Eventually you forget you were ever scared." Margaret had been putting off going through her aunt's personal belongings for almost 2 weeks. The clothes and furniture were one thing, but the boxes of letters and photographs felt too private, too intimate. It was like reading someone's diary without permission. But the lawyer had called yesterday, asking about paperwork that might be in Rebecca's personal files, so she couldn't avoid it any longer. She started in the bedroom, opening the small desk by the window where Rebecca had apparently paid bills and written letters. The drawers were organized in a way that surprised Margaret. Her aunt had always seemed scattered at family gatherings, the kind of person who forgot where she put her keys and showed up late to everything. But here, everything had a place and purpose. The top drawer held current bills and correspondence, all neatly filed and labeled. The second drawer was more interesting, filled with seed catalogs and gardening magazines, pages marked with notes in Rebecca's careful handwriting. "Try this for the north fence. Ask Jake about soil drainage. Remember, late frost possible until May 15th. It was the bottom drawer that made Margaret sit down heavily in the desk chair. It was full of letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Rebecca in different handwritings. Letters from friends, from other family members, from people Margaret had never heard of. But what caught her attention were the dates. Most of them were from the last 5 years since Rebecca had moved to the ranch. Margaret had always assumed her aunt lived a lonely life out here, isolated from friends and family. But these letters told a different story. There were thank you notes from neighbors, Christmas cards from people she'd met at the farmer's market, updates from old friends who promised to visit soon. One letter was different from the rest. The handwriting was familiar, though Margaret couldn't place it at first. Then she realized it was Jake's writing, though these were older letters from before he'd come to work at the ranch. "Dear Rebecca," the first one began, "thank you for taking a chance on hiring me despite my lack of references. I know you didn't have to give me this opportunity, and I want you to know how much it means to me." Margaret hesitated. These were private letters not meant for her eyes, but something about the tone made her keep reading. "I've been drifting for a while now, moving from job to job and never quite finding a place where I fit. Working here, helping you build something real, it feels different. It feels like home." The letters were dated over several years, chronicling Jake's life at the ranch and his growing friendship with Rebecca. Margaret learned things she never could have guessed. Jake had been in the military, deployed overseas for several tours, before coming home to find he didn't quite fit into civilian life anymore. He'd worked construction and ranch jobs across 3 states, always moving on when things got too complicated or too personal. "You asked me today why I never talk about my family," one letter read. "The truth is, I haven't spoken to my parents in 4 years. We had a falling out when I got back from my last deployment. They wanted me to be the same person who left for the war, and I couldn't explain why that wasn't possible anymore. You're the first person who's ever just accepted me as I am right now without needing to know who I used to be." Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. She was reading about a side of Jake she'd never seen, a vulnerability he kept hidden behind his quiet competence and gentle humor. Another letter, dated just 2 years ago, revealed even more. "Rebecca, I want you to know that working here has saved my life in ways I'm not sure I can put into words. When I first came here, I was angry all the time, jumping at loud noises, not sleeping well. You never asked questions, never made me feel broken or damaged. You just gave me work to do and space to heal. The animals don't care about my bad days, and the land doesn't judge me for the things I've seen or done. Some mornings, feeding the chickens with you, I forget to be sad for whole hours at a time." Margaret set the letter down with shaking hands. She'd had no idea. Jake had always seemed so steady, so at peace with himself and his place in the world. To learn that he'd been struggling, that this ranch had been his refuge just as it was becoming hers, created a connection between them she hadn't expected. The last letter in the collection was dated just 6 months ago. "Rebecca, the doctors say you need to start thinking about the future, about what happens if your health gets worse. I know you don't like talking about it, but I want you to know that whatever happens, this place will be okay. I'll make sure of it. You've given me a home and a purpose, and I promise I'll take care of everything you've built here." Margaret understood now why Jake had been so careful with her, so patient with her questions and fears. He wasn't just the hired help looking after the place. He was someone who had loved Rebecca like family, someone who was grieving her loss just as much as any blood relative would. She put the letters back carefully and moved to Rebecca's dresser, where she found a small jewelry box filled not with expensive pieces, but with simple tokens that had obviously meant something special. A smooth river rock, a pressed flower, a small silver locket with a picture of the ranch inside it. At the bottom of the jewelry box was a folded piece of paper with Margaret's name on it. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Margaret," the letter began in Rebecca's familiar handwriting. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're trying to figure out what to do with this old place. I know this probably wasn't what you expected to inherit, and I know it's not the kind of life you're used to living." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the letter. "I chose to leave the ranch to you because I see something in you that reminds me of myself at your age. You're scared of taking chances, scared of failing, scared of being someone different than who you think you're supposed to be. I know because I felt the same way for 40 years. The letter went on to describe Rebecca's life in Chicago, the successful career that felt empty, the relationships that never quite worked, the constant feeling that she was living someone else's life. Coming here saved me, Margaret. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. Everything here has a purpose. The work matters, the animals depend on you, the land responds to care and attention. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks, thinking about her own life in Boston, the job that paid well but left her feeling hollow, the apartment that never quite felt like home, the relationships that always seemed to require her to be smaller, quieter, less than she wanted to be. Jake will help you if you let him, the letter continued. He's a good man who's been through more than most people could handle, but he's found peace here just like I did. He knew I was writing this letter, and he promised me he'd stay as long as you need him, help you learn everything you need to. No, but don't feel obligated to keep him on just because I asked. He'll understand if you want to make your own choices. The letter ended with words that made Margaret's heart ache. Whatever you decide to do with this place, know that you have the strength to handle it. You come from strong women, Margaret. Your grandmother survived the Depression, I survived my own fears, and you can survive whatever comes next. Trust yourself, trust the land, and if you're lucky enough to find someone who sees the real you and loves you anyway, trust that too. Love, Aunt Rebecca. Margaret sat in the quiet bedroom for a long time, holding the letter and thinking about everything she'd learned. Through the window, she could see Jake working in the garden, his movements efficient and peaceful. A man who'd been broken by war and disappointment, who'd found healing in the simple act of tending growing things. She thought about the Jake she'd been getting to know over the past weeks, patient and kind and never pushing her to be anything other than herself. Now she understood that his gentleness came from his own experience with being fragile, with needing time and space to heal. When she finally went outside, Jake looked up from the tomato plants and smiled. Find what you were looking for? More than I expected, Margaret said quietly. Something in her voice made him straighten up, studying her face with concern. You okay? Margaret nodded, then found herself saying something she hadn't planned. I read some of your letters to Rebecca. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to invade your privacy, but they were mixed in with other papers and... Jake's face went still, and for a moment Margaret thought he might be angry. Then his shoulders relaxed and he managed a small smile. She probably left them there on purpose. Rebecca wasn't much for coincidences. He pulled off his work gloves and sat on the porch steps. What did you think? Margaret sat beside him, close enough to smell the earth on his clothes and the soap he used. I think you're braver than you give yourself credit for. And I think, Jake said quietly, that maybe you are too. Margaret's phone had been buzzing all morning, and she'd been ignoring it. But when it rang for the 10th time while she was collecting eggs, she finally pulled it from her pocket. The caller ID made her stomach clench. David, her boyfriend, back. In Boston. She answered on the 4th ring, trying to sound normal. Hi. Finally, David's voice came through sharp and impatient. I've been calling you for hours. What's going on out there? You were supposed to be back 2 weeks ago. Margaret looked around at the chicken coop, at Henrietta pecking contentedly, at the ground near her feet, at the morning sun casting long shadows across the peaceful yard. 2 weeks ago felt like a lifetime. Things are more complicated than I expected, she said carefully. How complicated can it be? Sign the papers, put the place up for sale, come home. That's what you said you were going to do. Margaret had said that. She remembered standing in her Boston apartment, irritated at having to deal with this unexpected inheritance, planning to get it over with as quickly as possible. That person felt like a stranger now. I'm still figuring things out, she said. Margaret, you're being ridiculous. You have a job here, a life here. You can't just disappear into the wilderness and expect everything to wait for you. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jake working in the garden, his movements calm and purposeful. He'd been teaching her about companion planting yesterday, showing her how certain vegetables grew better when planted together, how they could help and protect each other. I haven't disappeared, Margaret said. I'm just ... Darning some things. Learning. What? How to milk cows? David's laugh was sharp. Come on, be serious. This isn't you. You're a city person. You belong here with people who understand you. But that was the problem, Margaret realized. David didn't understand her. He understood the version of herself she'd been presenting to. The world, the careful, controlled person who never took risks or caused problems. He had no idea about the woman who was learning to collect eggs without fear, who was discovering muscles she'd never used, who was falling asleep to the sound of crickets instead of sirens. I need more time, she said. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. When David spoke again, his voice was different, colder. How much more time? I don't know. You don't know? He repeated the words like they tasted bad. Margaret, I've been patient about this whole thing, but enough is enough. I have plans for us, goals we've talked about. Remember the wedding we were going to start planning? Remember. The apartment we were going to look at when you got back? Margaret did remember. She remembered nodding along to David's plans while feeling like she was watching someone else's life unfold. She remembered agreeing to wedding venues and apartment tours while feeling disconnected from it all, like she was reading lines from a script she'd never auditioned for. Those plans? She started, then stopped. How could she explain that those plans felt like they belonged to someone else now? What about them? Maybe they're not what I want anymore. Another long silence. When David spoke again, Margaret could hear the anger he was trying to control. This is about that cowboy, isn't it? Margaret's cheeks flushed hot. What are you talking about? Don't pretend you don't know what I mean. Some local guy who's been showing you around, making you think this simple life is romantic or something? It's not real, Margaret. It's a fantasy. Jake is just helping me understand the property, she said, but even as the words came out, she knew they weren't the whole truth. Jake? David said the name like it proved his point. Right, let me guess, he's rugged and quiet and doesn't understand your big city ways. But underneath it all, he's really deep and sensitive. Margaret wanted to defend Jake, to explain that. He wasn't some stereotype from a movie, that he was complex and thoughtful and had been through more than David could imagine. But she also knew that anything she said would only confirm David's suspicions. This isn't about Jake, she said instead. Then what is it about? Because from where I'm sitting, you've lost your mind. You're throwing away everything we've built. Together for what? To play farmer with some guy you barely know? The accusation stung because there was enough truth in it to hurt. She was changing her entire life based on feelings she barely understood, connections that were still new and fragile. By any logical measure, David was right to be concerned, but logic wasn't the only measure anymore. Standing in this peaceful yard, feeling more like herself than she had in years, Margaret knew that going back to Boston would feel like putting on clothes that no longer fit. Her other phone line beeped with an incoming call. Work. She declined it. But David had heard the sound. Let me guess, that was your boss. The job you're supposed to be doing, the career you've worked for years to build. Margaret's supervisor had been calling every few days, initially sympathetic about her family situation, but growing increasingly frustrated as her absence stretched on. There were projects waiting for her, deadlines approaching, responsibilities she was neglecting. I can do my work from anywhere, she said weakly. No, you can't. Not really. Not the kind of work that leads to promotions and partnerships. You're sabotaging your future for a temporary adventure. That evening, Margaret sat on the porch after Jake had gone home to his cabin. The sunset was painting the sky in colors she'd never paid attention to in the city, where buildings blocked most of the horizon. She pulled out her laptop and tried to work on a project she'd been putting off. But the words on the screen felt meaningless. In Boston, she'd been proud of her job at the library system, coordinating digital archives and helping preserve historical documents. It was important work that mattered. But sitting here surrounded by growing things and wide-open spaces, the urgency of digitizing 19th-century city records felt distant and abstract. Her phone buzzed with a text from her. Best friend Ashley, David called me. He's really worried about you. Says you're not acting like yourself. Are you okay? Margaret stared at the message for a long time. Was she okay? By the standards of her old life, probably not. She was behind on work, neglecting her relationship, making impulsive decisions about her future. But she'd also never felt more awake. More present in her own life. She started to type a response several times, then deleted it. How could she explain that she was becoming someone she'd never been brave enough to be before? How could she describe the satisfaction of work that tired your body instead of your mind, of relationships built on shared silence as much as conversation? The next morning, Jake knocked on her door earlier than usual. When she opened it, he was holding a thermos of coffee and wearing an expression she couldn't quite read. "Heard your phone ringing a lot yesterday," he said gently. "Everything okay back home?" Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully, breathing in the familiar rich smell. "Define okay." They sat on the porch steps, watching the chickens start their day. The routine had become precious to Margaret, these quiet morning moments before the day's work began. In Boston, mornings were rushed affairs of alarms and subway schedules and coffee grabbed on the way to somewhere else. "Want to talk about it?" Jake asked. Margaret found herself telling him about David's call, about the pressure from work, about the growing realization that the life she'd built in Boston might not be the life she actually wanted. Jake listened without judgment occasionally, asking questions but mostly just being present while she worked through her confusion out loud. "Sounds like you've got some thinking to do," he said when she finished. "What would you do?" she asked. "If you were me?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching Henrietta lead her flock toward their favorite scratching spot near the barn. "I spent a lot of years living the life other people thought I should live," he said finally. "Following orders, doing what was expected, being who I was supposed to be. Took me a long time to figure out that nobody else gets to decide what makes you happy. But what if I'm wrong? What if this is just some kind of breakdown and in 6 months I'll regret giving up everything I worked for? And what if you're right?" Jake countered gently. "What if this is exactly where you're supposed to be, and in 6 months you'll wonder why you waited so long to trust yourself?" Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. "I'm scared." "Good," Jake said simply. "Being scared means it matters." That afternoon, Margaret walked alone through the fields behind the house, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions and obligations pulling her in different directions. Part of her missed the certainty of her old life, the clear expectations and predictable routines. But a bigger part of her dreaded the thought of going back to feeling like a stranger in her own skin. Her phone rang again. This time it was her mother. Double quotes Margaret. "David called me. He's very concerned about you. We all are." And so the pressure continued, well-meaning people who loved her trying to pull her back to a life that had felt safe but not satisfying. Margaret realized that choosing this new path would mean disappointing people, letting them down in ways that might change her, relationships forever, but choosing the old path would mean disappointing herself in ways that might change her relationship. With her own soul forever, standing in that wide-open field, surrounded by sky and silence, Margaret began to understand that some choices couldn't be made with logic alone. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Margaret was feeding the chickens. Her supervisor's voice was crisp and professional, but Margaret could hear the underlying frustration. "Margaret, I need to be direct with you. The Henderson Archive project deadline is next Friday. If you're not back by tomorrow, I'll have to assign it to someone else. This is a career-making opportunity, and frankly, I'm not sure why you're hesitating." Margaret watched Pepper peck at the grain she'd scattered, completely focused on the simple task of finding breakfast. Everything here was so immediate, so present. The chickens didn't worry about next week or next year. They lived fully in each moment. "I understand," Margaret said, though she wasn't sure she did anymore. "Do you? Because from where I sit, you're throwing away 5 years of building your reputation for what, exactly? Some family property you can hire people to manage?" After the call ended, Margaret sat on the porch steps feeling like the world was spinning too fast. The Henderson project was everything she'd been working toward, A chance to lead the digitization of a major historical collection that would establish her as a serious archivist. 2 months ago, she would have done anything to get this assignment. Jake found her there an hour later, still in the same position. "Bad news?" he asked gently. "Career news," Margaret said. "The kind that's supposed to be good news." She told him about the project, about the opportunity she was letting slip away, about the years of work that had led to this moment. Jake listened without trying to solve her problems or tell her what to do, which somehow made it easier to think clearly. "Sounds important," he said when she finished. "It is, or it was." "I don't know anymore." Margaret picked at a loose thread on her jeans. 3 months ago, this would have been the most important thing in my life. And now? Margaret looked around at the ranch, at the garden where tomatoes were starting to turn red, at the chicken coop where her new friends were settling in for their afternoon dust baths. Now it feels like someone else's dream. That afternoon, David called again. This time his approach was different, softer. "Maggie, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Maybe I was too harsh? I know this inheritance thing has been overwhelming for you." Margaret noticed he was using her childhood nickname, the one he only brought out when he wanted something. It used to make her feel special. Now it felt calculated. "I've been doing some research," David continued. "There are property management companies that specialize in rural properties. You could hire one to handle everything, maybe even turn it into a vacation rental. You wouldn't have to give up your whole life. What if I don't want to turn it into a vacation rental? Then what do you want to do with it?" The question hung in the air between them. What did she want? Not what made sense financially, not what other people expected, but what she actually wanted. "I want to live here," she heard herself say. "I want to wake up every morning and feed the chickens and work in the garden and watch the sunset from the porch." David's silence stretched uncomfortably long. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "That's not a career, Margaret. That's not a future. That's playing house with some fantasy about simple living. What if it's not a fantasy? What if it's just a different way of living? A way of living that doesn't include me, apparently." The hurt in his voice was real, and Margaret felt guilt twist in her stomach. David wasn't a bad person. He was smart and successful and had been a good boyfriend by all reasonable measures. He'd never been unkind to her, never asked her to be anyone other than who she appeared to be. But that was the problem. He'd fallen in love with the version of herself she'd presented to the world. The careful, ambitious woman who made sensible choices and never caused trouble. He didn't know about the part of her that had always wanted. To try things that scared her, to live more boldly, to matter in ways that went beyond professional achievements. "David, I care about you," she said quietly. "But I don't think I'm the person you need me to be anymore." "You're the person I fell in love with." "No," Margaret said with sudden clarity. "You fell in love with who I was pretending to be. I fell in love with who I thought I was supposed to be. But neither of those people was really me." After she hung up, Margaret walked out to the garden where Jake was harvesting the last of the summer squash. He looked up when she approached, took one look at her face, and set down his basket. "Want to help me with something?" he asked. Without waiting for an answer, he led her to the barn and showed her a project he'd been working on. In one corner, he'd been building something that looked like a large wooden frame. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "Greenhouse frame. Your aunt wanted?" "To build one so she could grow vegetables year-round, but we never got around to it." Jake ran his hand along one of the smooth wooden joints. "Figured maybe you'd want to finish what she started." Margaret stared at the partially built frame, understanding the gift he was offering her. Not just help with a building project, but a reason to stay, a way to connect with Rebecca's dreams and make them her own. "I don't know anything about building greenhouses," she said. "Neither did I until I started. We'll figure it out together." That evening, Margaret sat at Rebecca's desk and opened her laptop to write the email she'd been avoiding. Her resignation letter took 3 drafts to get right, professional but honest, acknowledging the opportunities she was leaving behind while staying true to her decision. To David, she wrote something harder. A letter trying to explain feelings she barely understood herself, apologizing for changing into someone he hadn't signed up for. thanking him for the good times while acknowledging that they wanted different futures. The next morning, Jake knocked on her door carrying coffee and something else, a small wrapped package. "Rebecca asked me to give this to you if you decided to stay," he said simply. Inside the package was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and full of possibility. The cover was worn smooth by years of handling, and when Margaret opened it, she found an inscription in Rebecca's handwriting. "For Margaret, who is braver than she knows. Fill these pages with your own adventures." Margaret looked up to find Jake watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "She knew," Margaret said. "Somehow she knew I'd choose to stay." Rebecca was good at seeing people's true selves even when they couldn't see it themselves. They stood on the porch together, drinking coffee and watching the chickens start their day. It was a scene Margaret had experienced dozens of times now, but today it felt different. Today it felt like the beginning of something rather than a temporary pause in her real life. "Jake," she said quietly, "what you said about not asking me to stay, I meant it. This has to be your choice, not mine. But what if I told you I want you to want me to stay?" Jake turned to look at her fully, his eyes serious. "Then I'd tell you that I've been hoping you'd decide to stay since about the third day you were here. But I'd also tell you that you're staying for the right reasons, which is more important than staying for me." Margaret felt something settle into place inside her chest, a sense of rightness she'd never experienced before. She was staying not because someone else needed her to, not because she was running away from something, but because she was running toward the person she'd always been meant to be. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Jake said, echoing his words from days before. "The best things in life are a little scary." As the sun climbed higher, painting the fields gold and green, Margaret opened the journal Rebecca had left her and wrote her first entry. "Day 1 of my real life," she began. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." 6 months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of the completed greenhouse, watching steam rise from her coffee cup in the cool December air. Inside the glass walls, tomato plants climbed toward the ceiling and lettuce grew in neat rows that would have made Rebecca proud. It had taken them 3 months to build. Working mostly on weekends and rainy days when the outdoor work was finished, the building process had been a revelation. Margaret had never imagined she could learn to use power tools or understand architectural plans. But Jake had been patient, showing her how to measure twice and cut once, how to read the grain of wood, how to trust her hands to do work she'd never thought possible. More than that, building the greenhouse together had been like building their relationship, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, shared joke by shared mistake. They'd learned each other's rhythms, discovered how to work as a team, figured out how to disagree about construction details without hurting each other's feelings. "It's beautiful," Jake said, coming up behind her with his own steaming mug. "Rebecca would have loved it." Margaret leaned back against his shoulder, a gesture that had become natural over the past few months. They'd taken their time with the romance, letting it grow as slowly and naturally as the vegetables in Rebecca's garden. There had been no dramatic declarations or movie-perfect moments, just a gradual deepening of friendship into something more precious and more lasting. Their first kiss had happened on a perfectly ordinary evening in September. They'd been sitting on the porch after finishing the day's work, talking about plans for the winter garden, when Margaret had realized she was more interested in watching Jake's face than listening to his words. When he noticed her attention, wondering, he'd raised his eyebrows in amused question, and somehow that had led to leaning closer, and then to the soft, tentative touch of lips that felt like coming home. "I have something to tell you," Margaret said now, turning in his arms to face him properly. Jake's expression grew serious. "Good something or concerning something?" "Good something. Excellent something, actually." Margaret pulled a letter from her pocket. "I heard back from the farmers market coordinator. They want to give us a regular spot starting in the spring." Jake's face lit up with the smile that still made Margaret's heart skip a little. They'd been talking about selling their extra vegetables and Rebecca's famous preserves, turning the hobby garden into a small business that could help support the ranch. "That's amazing," he said, lifting her off the ground in a hug that made her laugh. "When do we start?" April, which gives us all winter to plan what we want to grow. Figure out pricing, maybe learn how to make some of Rebecca's recipes. They'd found Rebecca's canning notebooks the month before, detailed instructions for making everything from strawberry jam to pickled vegetables. Margaret had tried her hand at making apple butter from the orchard behind the house, and while her first batch had been a little too sweet, Jake had declared it better than anything from the store. The business idea had started as a practical matter, a way to make the ranch more financially sustainable. But as they'd talked about it over autumn evenings, it had become something more. A way to share Rebecca's legacy with the community, to connect with neighbors, to build something meaningful together. There's something else, Margaret said, suddenly nervous about the second piece of news she'd been saving. More good news? I think so, I hope so. Margaret took a deep breath. My mother called yesterday. She wants to come visit for Christmas. Jake's eyebrows rose. Margaret's family had been complicated about her decision to stay. Her mother had spent months alternating between worry and disappointment, unable to understand why Margaret would give up her career for what she called playing farmer. Her father had been more supportive but still confused, asking careful questions about her plan as if she might suddenly announce this had all been a temporary adventure. How do you feel about that? Jake asked carefully. Terrified, Margaret admitted, but also ready, I think. I want her to see this place the way I see it. I want her to understand that I'm not running away from my life. I'm running toward it. Over the past months, Margaret had slowly rebuilt her relationship with her family from a distance. Phone calls where she talked about her day-to-day life, photos of the garden and the chickens, stories about her neighbors and the small community she was becoming part of. Gradually, her mother's concern had shifted from alarm to curiosity. She's bringing my sister too, Margaret continued. Jenny's excited about seeing the chickens. She's 8 now, and apparently she's been telling everyone at school that her aunt lives on a farm. Jake smiled. Henrietta will love the attention. She's always been a show-off. They walked out to check on the chickens who were pecking around in the late morning sun. Henrietta looked up as they approached, making her usual greeting sounds. Margaret still marveled at how these birds had become individuals to her, each with their own personality and preferences. Remember when you were afraid they'd peck you? Jake asked, watching as Pepper approached Margaret looking for treats. That feels like a different lifetime, Margaret said, crouching down to let Pepper inspect her hands. I was afraid of everything. Then, not everything. You got on that plane and came here all by yourself, Margaret considered this. It was true that even scared, she'd taken the first step. Maybe courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. What's the scariest thing you've done lately? She asked Jake. He was quiet for a moment, watching the chickens with thoughtful eyes. Letting myself fall in love with you, he said finally. Letting myself believe this could really work. Margaret felt her heart expand in her chest. They didn't say, I love you, often, both of them still careful with words that carried so much weight. But when they did say it, it felt like a gift, precious, because it was chosen rather than expected. For me it was staying, Margaret said. Not just deciding to stay, but letting myself believe I belonged here. They spent the afternoon working on plans for the spring garden, spreading Rebecca's gardening books across the kitchen table and making lists of seeds to order. Margaret had discovered she loved this kind of planning, thinking ahead to seasons and harvests, imagining the greenhouse full of seedlings waiting to be transplanted. What do you think Rebecca would say if she could see us now? Margaret asked, as they cleaned up their planning materials. I think she'd say we're exactly where we're supposed to be, Jake replied. And then she'd probably ask why we haven't fixed that loose board on the front porch yet, Margaret laughed. Rebecca had left? Them detailed lists of maintenance tasks organized by season and priority. Margaret had initially found the lists overwhelming, but now she appreciated having Rebecca's wisdom to guide them through their first year of real ranch ownership. That evening, they sat on the porch with blankets wrapped around them, watching. The sun set over fields that were dormant now, but full of promise for spring. Margaret pulled out the journal Rebecca had given her and read Jake her entry from that morning. Day 184 of my real life, she read aloud. Built a greenhouse, planned a business, invited my family to see my new world. 6 months ago, I thought courage meant not being afraid. Now I know it means being afraid and choosing love anyway. Choosing growth anyway. Choosing the unknown anyway because the known wasn't big enough for who I'm becoming. She looked up to find Jake watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it took her breath away. "What?" she asked. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he said simply. "That Rebecca left this place to someone brave enough to become who it needed." "We're both lucky," Margaret said, reaching for his hand. "We found each other, we found this place, we found ourselves." As stars began to appear in the clear winter sky, Margaret thought about the woman who had arrived here 6 months ago, terrified of chickens and uncertain about everything. That woman had been looking for a quick exit strategy, a way to return to safety as soon as possible. Instead, she'd found the courage to stay and build something beautiful. She'd learned that the unknown wasn't something to be feared, but something to be embraced. That love wasn't just about finding the right person, but about becoming the right person yourself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new learning, new opportunities to choose courage over comfort. But tonight, wrapped in blankets and love and the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling into darkness, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The chickens had long since settled into their coop for the night, safe and content in the home they'd always known. And Margaret, like them, had finally learned the difference between being pecked by life and being embraced by it.